The champagne glass trembled in my hand as my father lifted the blue leather folder. We were at the elegant ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, celebrating his 30 years at the helm of Whitaker Industrial. The room was filled with the smell of expensive cologne and roasted meats. I watched my father's face as he leaned into the microphone. He looked older, but his eyes were bright with a secret he was finally ready to share with the room. "And now," he said, smiling at my younger brother, Daniel, like he had just won the lottery, "it's time to make it official for everyone. My retirement begins tonight, and Whitaker Industrial now belongs to Daniel." The applause was immediate and loud. People stood up, cheering and whistling. I stood there 30 feet from the stage, heat flooding my face and neck. My name was not even mentioned once. I had spent 12 years building that company's most profitable division, and in one single sentence, I was completely erased. Daniel walked up to the stage, pretending to be humble while he adjusted his expensive silk tie. "I really couldn't have done any of this without the family," he told the crowd, his voice booming through the speakers. The family. His eyes flicked toward me briefly as he spoke. There was a look in them that felt almost apologetic, but it was buried under a thick layer of smug satisfaction. He knew this was coming. I forced a smile so tight that my jaw started to hurt. My mother reached out, squeezed my arm tightly, and whispered into my ear, "Sweetheart, you were never meant to carry this heavy burden. This is better for you. Better." That was the exact moment something deep inside me went quiet. I didn't feel like crying or screaming. Instead, I felt a cold, sharp clarity that I had never experienced before. I realized that my parents didn't see my hard work as a contribution, but as a temporary fix. My name is Charlotte Whitaker. I am 34 years old, and I have dedicated my entire adult life to the family business. I am the one who built the logistics optimization model that tripled the margins for Whitaker Industrial in just 5 years. I was the person who negotiated the massive Harris Freight contract when we were only weeks away from filing for bankruptcy. I slept on the uncomfortable office couch more nights than I actually slept in my own bed. I sacrificed my personal life, my hobbies, and my sleep to ensure the Whitaker name stayed respected in the manufacturing world. But I was not the son. I was not the one they bragged about at country club dinners. Apparently, being the firstborn male mattered more than any financial result I could ever produce. As I watched Daniel shake hands with the investors, I realized I had been building a house on land that was never truly mine to keep. This pattern wasn't exactly new, but seeing it on a stage made it feel permanent. When Daniel crashed his first tech startup and lost $2 million of my father's money, Dad called it entrepreneurial spirit. He told everyone that Daniel was learning the hard way. When I worked 18-hour days to save the company from a massive supplier lawsuit that would have ended us, my father called it a team effort. Daniel was always seen for his potential, even though he had never actually finished anything in his life. I was only seen for my reliability. In my family, reliability was treated like the air we breathe. It was completely invisible and totally taken for granted. They expected me to be the safety net while Daniel got to be the star. I looked at my mother's face as she beamed at her son. She didn't see a worker. She saw her baby boy finally taking his rightful place at the top. After the retirement dinner ended, I found my parents in the quiet, dim hallway of the hotel. "You didn't even discuss this with me," I said, keeping my voice level and calm despite the storm inside. My father sighed deeply, looking at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "You're brilliant, Charlotte. Everyone knows that. But Daniel needs this challenge to grow. You'll always land on your feet because you are strong. Translation: he is fragile and needs a handout, but you are tough enough to handle being pushed aside." My mother added softly, "You really don't want the constant stress of ownership, dear. It would be too much for you." I swallowed my pride and stayed silent. They didn't understand that I already carried the stress. I had been carrying the weight of the company on my shoulders for a decade. They were giving Daniel the title, but I was the one who had been doing the heavy lifting. I went back to my office on Monday morning. It felt different now. It was the same desk, the same view of the city, and the same team waiting for their morning briefings. But I had a new boss. Daniel walked into the building like he owned the very air we were breathing. To be fair, on paper, he did own it. He stopped by my desk, leaning against the doorframe with a coffee cup in his hand. "Hey, sis. I'm thinking of changing the reporting structure. I want my friends from college to handle the logistics side. That was the moment I realized something critical. I had a choice to make right then. I could stay here and fight for the scraps of a company I helped create, or I could leave. I realized that while Daniel had the ownership papers, I had something far more powerful. I had the knowledge, the systems, and most importantly, the deep personal relationships with our clients. 3 weeks later, I walked into Daniel's new, oversized office and handed him my resignation. There was no big scene. I didn't yell, and I didn't point out how unfair the situation was. I just presented a professional letter and spoke with a steady, unwavering voice. Daniel actually blinked in surprise, looking at the paper like it was a joke. "You're overreacting, Charlotte," he said, letting out a nervous laugh. "Dad said you might be a little sensitive about the transition, but this is ridiculous. You belong here." I looked at him and felt a strange sense of peace. "I'm not overreacting, Daniel. I'm evolving," I replied. He looked at me with total confusion. He didn't understand the difference between quitting in a huff and leaving because you have outgrown a space that refuses to let you lead. I walked out of that building without looking back at the Whitaker logo. I knew that the logo was just a sign on a wall. I decided to take a senior operations role at a mid-sized competitor called Caldwell Supply Group. It was a completely different world. They had a much smaller budget than Whitaker, and there was no famous family name to open doors for me. I had no safety net here. If I failed, I would be fired. For the first time in my entire life, my last name meant absolutely nothing to the people I worked with. It was terrifying to be out on my own without the Whitaker shield, but it was also incredibly freeing. I didn't have to worry about my father's approval or my mother's quiet judgments. I could just be an operator. I started working on their supply chain, applying the same logic I had perfected over the years. I was building something from scratch, and for the first time, I knew that every win would be credited to my name alone. I felt like a real professional for the first time. 6 months after I left, I started to hear the whispers. The manufacturing industry is a small world, and news travels fast among the warehouse managers and truck drivers. Daniel had followed through on his plan to replace the senior managers with his college friends. They were guys who liked the idea of being executives, but didn't know the first thing about lean manufacturing or inventory turnover. The margins at Whitaker Industrial were slipping fast. Quality control was becoming an issue, and late shipments were starting to pile up. One of Whitaker's largest freight clients reached out to me on LinkedIn, asking if I had time for a quick, off-the-record phone call. They were frustrated and looking for answers. I said absolutely nothing negative about my brother or the company. I just listened. I learned a long time ago that you don't have to throw stones when someone is already busy digging their own grave with a silver shovel. At Caldwell Supply, I implemented the same efficiency systems I had built before, but this time, I made them even better. I had learned from my past mistakes, and here, there were no emotional politics to slow me down. There was no favoritism, and no one to tell me that my ideas were too aggressive for a woman. I focused purely on performance and data. Within 1 quarter, our delivery times dropped by 18%. The cost of goods sold decreased, and our client satisfaction scores reached an all-time high for the company. The executives at Caldwell definitely noticed. They didn't call it a team effort to diminish my role. They called me into the boardroom and thanked me specifically for my leadership. For the first time in my career, recognition felt clean and honest. It wasn't a crumb dropped from a table. It was a seat at the table that I had earned through my own hard work. A few weeks later, the executive from Harris Freight, a man named Mr. Bennett, requested a formal meeting. He didn't call the main line at Whitaker Industrial. He called my personal cell phone. We met at a quiet cafe far away from the industrial district. "I heard you're no longer with your family's company, Charlotte," he said carefully, watching my reaction over his glasses. "That's correct," I told him, keeping my expression neutral. He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "We signed that original 5-year contract with Whitaker because of you. We trusted your oversight and your logistics model. Since you left, the service has become unreliable. The new guy, Daniel, doesn't even return our calls until 3 days later." That was the very first crack in the foundation of Daniel's inheritance. People didn't care about the Whitaker name as much as my parents thought. They cared about the person who kept the trucks moving on time. Harris Freight didn't cancel their contract with Whitaker Industrial immediately. They were too smart for that, as they needed to ensure they had a backup plan first. Instead, they just started to adjust the terms of their agreement. They moved to a much shorter contract and insisted on performance-based renewals. If Whitaker missed more than 3 delivery windows in a month, the contract would become void. Daniel was so arrogant that he didn't even realize he was effectively on probation. He thought he had won because he had the signed papers in his desk drawer. He didn't understand that ownership papers didn't guarantee the loyalty of a long-term client. Trust was the actual currency of the industry, and trust was something Daniel had never bothered to build. He assumed the clients would stay because our grandfather had started the company 30 years ago. He was wrong. In business, nobody cares about your grandfather when their own shelves are empty. The word spread quickly through the industry that Whitaker Industrial had reported its first quarterly loss in over a decade. The local business journals started picking up the story, questioning the leadership transition. The investors were getting extremely nervous. My father actually had to come out of his short-lived retirement to step back in as a senior advisor. He tried to smooth things over with the bank, but the numbers were hard to ignore. Daniel blamed the losses on unfavorable market conditions and unforeseen global shifts. The truth was that the market was doing just fine. Every other manufacturing firm in the area was showing growth. The problem wasn't the market, it was the leadership inside the Whitaker building. My father called me once, asking if I would come back to help Daniel get organized. I told him I was busy with my new role. He didn't like that answer, but he couldn't force me to return. A few weeks after that phone call, I was called into the CEO's office at Caldwell. They offered me the position of Vice President of Operations. There was no family vote required, and there was no favoritism involved. It was based entirely on the results I had delivered over the last year. I looked at the contract for a long time before signing it. I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with my parents' approval. I signed the document with steady, confident hands. For the first time in my life, my success felt entirely and completely mine. I wasn't the daughter of a founder anymore. I was a top-tier executive who had been headhunted by a competitor. I realized that my parents backing Daniel was actually the best thing that could have happened to me. It forced me to prove to myself that I was the real engine behind the Whitaker success, regardless of the name on the building. One rainy afternoon, the CEO of Caldwell approached me privately in the break room. "Charlotte, we're considering a major expansion. We're looking at a strategic acquisition to increase our footprint in the region." He slid a thick, yellow file across the table toward me. I opened it and saw the name on the first page, Whitaker Industrial. My pulse didn't change, and my face remained perfectly calm. I had trained myself to be a professional above all else. But my mind sharpened instantly. I knew every corner of that company. I knew where the waste was hidden and where the value truly lay. The CEO looked at me with a respectful nod. "I know it's your family, so I wanted to ask if you were comfortable being part of the team that evaluates this. We need your expertise." I closed the file and looked him in the eye. "I'm a professional," I said. "I'll treat it like any other deal." I spent the next 2 weeks reviewing the Whitaker financials with a clinical, detached focus. It was worse than the public reports suggested. Client retention was declining at an alarming rate. Executive salaries had been inflated to accommodate Daniel's friends, and there were massive operational inefficiencies that I recognized instantly. They were the very same problems I had fixed years ago, but Daniel had undone 5 years of my careful structure in just 12 months. He had prioritized office culture and branding over the actual mechanics of moving freight. I felt no joy seeing the wreckage of the company I once loved. I only felt a sense of cold clarity. It was like looking at a blueprint for a building that was designed to fall down. Daniel had been given a well-oiled machine, and he had let the sand into the gears. My father's retirement dream was turning into a financial nightmare for everyone involved in the company. The board at Caldwell Supply Group held a formal vote to initiate acquisition talks with Whitaker Industrial. It wasn't a hostile takeover attempt, it was just a strategic move. We knew they were struggling to meet their debt obligations, and we were in a position to offer them a way out before they went completely under. I chose to abstain from the formal vote to avoid any conflict of interest, but everyone in the room knew who understood Whitaker the best. They looked to me for the data and the strategy. The irony of the situation was almost poetic. My parents had pushed me out to protect Daniel's inheritance, and now I was the one deciding whether that inheritance was even worth buying. I wasn't seeking revenge, but I was definitely seeking a fair deal for my new company. I knew exactly what Whitaker was worth, and I wasn't going to let Caldwell overpay for a sinking ship. During the deep dive of due diligence, I uncovered something that I had completely forgotten about. Years ago, when I was still the logistics manager, I had refinanced a major portion of the company debt to save Whitaker from a predatory lender. To get the deal done at a low interest rate, I had been required to personally guarantee a portion of the restructuring agreement with my own assets. Buried deep in the legal clauses was a performance-triggered equity conversion. It was a standard protective measure for the guarantor. If the company defaulted under certain performance metrics for more than 3 consecutive quarters, a portion of the ownership shifted. Specifically, it shifted to me as the guarantor. Daniel and my father were so distracted by the title change that they hadn't even realized this clause existed in the old debt contracts. They had stopped reading the fine print long ago, assuming they were safe behind their desks. Whitaker Industrial officially breached the performance covenants for the 3rd quarter in a row. It happened quietly, legally, and entirely automatically. There was no big announcement. I didn't celebrate with champagne or a party. Instead, I contacted my legal team and had them review the documents one more time to be absolutely certain. The clause was completely valid and enforceable. Because the company's valuation had dropped so significantly under Daniel's leadership, the conversion was massive. I now held 22% of the equity in Whitaker Industrial. This wasn't an inheritance that was handed to me out of pity or tradition. This was equity that I had earned by putting my own financial future on the line years ago to save the firm. I realized that ownership wasn't always defined by what was written on the front page of a folder. Sometimes, it was hidden in the back of a contract that no one bothered to read. Caldwell Supply Group adjusted its acquisition strategy based on my new equity stake. Instead of a full buyout, we began to negotiate merger terms. My 22% stake gave me significant voting power in any major company decision. Daniel was forced to sit across a conference table from me in a glass-walled room downtown. For the first time in his life, he didn't look at me as his sensitive older sister who did the busy work. He looked at me as a major shareholder who held the power to decide his future. His confidence, which had always been so loud and unearned, finally began to falter. He sat there fumbling with his notes, while I sat there with a team of lawyers and accountants. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that it was almost uncomfortable. He realized that his father's gift was just a piece of paper, while my equity was a functional weapon in business. My father stared at the merger documents like they were written in a completely different language. We were in the Whitaker boardroom, the same room where he had once told me that Daniel needed the company more than I did. "You never told us about this equity conversion, Charlotte," he said quietly, his voice sounding thin and old. "You never asked," I replied, keeping my gaze steady. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just stating a fact. Daniel's voice cracked as he looked at the board members. "You planned this whole thing, didn't you? You've been waiting for us to fail." I shook my head slowly. "No, Daniel. I protected myself when the company was in trouble. I didn't plan for you to fail. I just didn't stop it from happening once you took over." There is a massive difference between sabotage and simply letting the consequences of poor leadership play out in real time. The merger between Caldwell and Whitaker eventually closed after weeks of tense negotiations. The new entity would be much stronger, but the leadership structure was going to change completely. Daniel was offered a mid-level operational role in the new company. It wasn't an ownership position, and it was strictly performance-based. He would have to report to a manager and hit targets every month. He looked at the offer and declined it instantly, his pride still too big for his bank account. The investors at Whitaker had completely withdrawn their confidence in him anyway. My father's legacy, which he had tried so hard to build on a foundation of favoritism, collapsed under its own weight. There was no massive scandal and no public drama. It was just the quiet, inevitable consequence of placing ego over competence. My parents lost their grip on the company they loved because they refused to value the person who actually knew how to run it. At the joint press conference a month later, the formation of Caldwell Whitaker Industries was officially announced to the public. I stood at the podium as the newly appointed chief operating officer of the merged entity. Reporters asked me about the transition and the future of the Whitaker name. I answered every question calmly and professionally. I explained that ownership in the modern world is about responsibility and results, not entitlement or birthright. Daniel wasn't present at the event. He had moved away to try another startup with the last of his savings. My parents were there, sitting in the back row, looking stunned by the reality of what had happened. They saw their daughter leading the company they once thought she couldn't handle. They saw the respect the industry had for me, and they finally realized that they had backed the wrong horse for all the wrong reasons. I finally felt seen. Months later, the profits at the new company finally stabilized. The transition was difficult, but the efficiency models were working. The employees, who once avoided eye contact with me back at Whitaker, now greeted me with genuine respect in the hallways. They didn't do it because I was the daughter of the founder. They did it because they knew I was the one who had saved their jobs. I had delivered on every promise I made. My parents were able to keep their retirement home, but the company name no longer answered to them or their whims. They were just observers now. I realized that a legacy doesn't survive on preference or tradition. It only survives on competence and the ability to adapt to a changing world. My father's retirement was finally quiet, but it wasn't the victory he had imagined. He had lost his company to the daughter he had once completely overlooked. I used to think that ownership simply meant having your name printed on a legal document in a fancy folder. I was wrong. I learned the hard way that ownership is actually about who people trust when everything is on fire and the building is shaking. Ownership is the person who stays late to fix the mistake. It's the person who understands the mechanics of the work. It's the person who signs the risky guarantee when everyone else is stepping back to save themselves. My parents backed my brother because they believed in a tradition that was hollow. But ownership told a completely different story. In the end, I didn't win because they lost. I didn't find joy in their failure. I won because I finally understood my own worth. I built something for myself that no one could ever take away from me. I was finally the owner of my own future, and that was the greatest inheritance.